Welcome to this, our first Evelyn Wrench speaker program of 2021, separated by a common language, the complicated relationships between American and British English with Dr. Lynne Murphy. I'm Director of Branch Services, Joshua Keppel-Gonzalez, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. Before we get started, I want to make a couple of announcements. Those of you who have attended our online events previously are already familiar, but for today's question and answer portion, which will occur at the end of the presentation, you can enter your questions into either the Q&A module or the chat module. Buttons to access both of these are located at the bottoms of your screen, of your Zoom screen. You can do this at any point during the presentation. It doesn't have to be during the Q&A portion. We will get to questions in the order received. Additionally, I want to thank the Central Florida, Atlanta, and New York branches for being the top 3 branches in terms of members who registered for today's talk with Lynne Murphy. Now, before we get to Lynne, I would like to introduce the ESU Executive Director, Karen Karpovich. Karen?
Hi, everyone. This has been a long journey to get Lynne here. I first learned about Lynne about a year ago from Paul Bogosian, who's the president of our Boston branch. And Paul is a Lynne groupie. I hope Paul is on the call, but he was the one that first told us about Lynne and said she has to be a Wrench speaker. And he pursued it. I mean, sending us copies of books and just keeping us in the loop on everything. So we had actually had planned to have Lynne come over when we were running our Wrench program in the traditional way of bringing her over from the UK and having her visit some of the branches. But unfortunately, that wasn't able to happen. And I'm sad about that, but maybe in the future we could still do that. So I'm really, really pleased that we're able to do it this way all the way from the UK. It seems like a very enjoyable event. It's going to be interesting hearing her points of view on things, being an American who's married to a Brit, who has a child, and just everything about it, because we're also, we're always being involved in a British organization. We're always making ourselves crazy with pronunciation and writing and whether or not to use the British spelling or what it is, but it just seems to be always a challenge for all of us. So I'd like to now introduce Lynne Murphy, and she's going to give us a very entertaining talk on the thing that we deal with all the time.
Thank you very much, Karen. And it is really lovely to be here in my house. I am very sad that I didn't get to come around to ESU branches this autumn. I was really looking forward to that, but we'll make the most of what we have here today. So I am going to share my slideshow with you. And I hope you see that now. If there's any problem with seeing that, someone in the...
Coming through clearly.
Great, glad to know it. So yes, so I am not on my slideshow. I'm not where I wanted to be. There, that's where I wanted to be. So yeah, so as was mentioned, I have given this talk to an ESU branch before in Boston. This is pretty much the same talk I gave there. So if you're joining from there, it's just going to be a refresher course. But I was doing this talk after publishing this book called The Prodigal Tongue, The Love-Hate Relationship Between American and British English, available from Penguin. If you live in the United States and Canada. If you live in the UK or the rest of the world, it's called The Prodigal Tongue, The Love-Hate Relationship Between British and American English, because I think it's nice for people always to feel like, you've let them go first. So we've got it both ways there. And I wrote this book after living in the UK for 18 years when it came out. And one of the questions that I'm often asked as a linguist, as an American in Britain, is how different are the two Englishes really? And there's a wonderful British phrase in answer to that question, that if you don't know the answer to something, you say, how long is a piece of string? How long is a piece of string? Well, it depends on if it's frayed. It depends on where you cut it. It depends, how, it's harder to measure if it's very loopy. There are so many ways of measuring a string, and there are so many ways of measuring the English language in different ways. So a lot of people feel like they're really familiar with the differences between American and British English, and probably some people in the ESU I keep thinking I'm saying EUS, but I am saying ESU. Some people in the ESU, I'm sure, go back and forth between Britain and America quite a bit. It's easy to be lulled into thinking that you know the differences, because some of them are just really, really obvious. So for instance, in spelling, we've got a handful of differences, which, everybody knows. So color with the U or without U, center with the RE or the ER. And so you start to think that you know these things until you've been around for a while and you start to notice the other ones, like mollusk, okay? Not as many people know that mollusk has different spellings in the two places. When we look at names for things, everybody knows that it's soccer in America, football in the US. It was soccer football in the UK, rather. It was soccer in the UK before it was soccer in the US. But we all know that there are different names for things. But sometimes it's hard to know just where that ends. So for instance, my American dialect, I would call this object a rollaway bed. Maybe you have another name for it. In Britain, a lot of people would call it a Z bed, okay? One you're less likely to run into. And then even if the names are the same, even if the words are the same, we've got different meanings. So, on the top there, we've got biscuits as the word means in Britain. On the bottom, we've got biscuits as the word means in America. That one, a lot of people know about. But did you know that if you order a sirloin steak in Britain, you're getting a different cut of meat than if you order a sirloin steak in America? So just so many little differences. Punctuation, if you read a lot of British books, you may have noticed that they tend to put their periods or full stops, as they'd say, on the outside of quotation marks, whereas Americans put them inside. But then there are things like, do you put a comma before somebody's name when you write them a happy birthday card? I discovered this one because I have 400 Facebook friends wishing me happy birthday, and I just decided to count which ones used a comma and which ones didn't. And you're twice as likely to have used a comma if you're American than if you're British. So this isn't one that's hard and fast. The British do it one way, Americans do it another, but it shows a general tendency in the two Englishes, with Americans using about 25% more commas than British people do. And then on top of all that, there's how and when we choose to use the words that we have, even if we have those words in common. So sorry, you might not be surprised to learn, is used about 4 times more often by the British than by Americans. It's also used a lot by Canadians, you probably know. But then there are the other ones that throw people, like, all right. So in Britain, amongst a lot of people, all right is a greeting. But the first time you hear that as an American over here, you think, oh my God, do I look like something's wrong with me? Do I look lost? And you try to answer the question, yes, I'm all right, thank you. But the correct response to all right in British English is all right. It's just a way of saying hello. Okay, so we've got all these things going on. That string is long, it's knotted, it's frayed, it's tangly, it's hard to count. And I do try to count sometimes. Just excuse me a sec with the camera a little bit. I've been writing this blog called Separated by a Common Language since 2006. So at that point, I had lived in Britain for 6 years. I'd lived in South Africa for 4 years before that. So I was pretty used to not speaking the same English as the people around me, but I was procrastinating on another project. So I started a blog and started to write down the things that I discovered along the way that surprised me. I think the first post was after my boss didn't understand what I meant when I talked about a roiling boil. He wouldn't have used the word roiling. Not everybody in America would either, but that is something that's particular to America. So I started this blog. This is a little selection here on this slide of some of the posts that I've done with the label food and cooking in them. And you can see things there like, which adjective do you use to describe the edge of a knife? What kind of flour are there? What kinds of flour are there? What kind do you want to use when you're baking bread? What kind do you want to use when you're baking cake? Black currants there, the issue for that blog post was just, why is there a space in it in American English and not in British English? And that took me down a whole rabbit hole of agricultural law and how black currants were banned in America for a very long time because it was feared that they'd bring fungus. It was a valid fear, but they were afraid that they would harm crops in America. So in Britain, anything that's grape flavored, and a lot of the things that are cherry flavored in America are blackcurrant flavored. Here, it's just a much more common word. And so it's compound closed up. So you've got all sorts of things like that. I've written about 600 of these posts on this blog. I lately have been doing it once a week. And each post has many, differences mentioned. And so that I was having so many ideas for things to put into blog posts and not enough time to write 1,000-word blog post every day. So I started tweeting about them. And so started tweeting a difference of the day every day since 2009. And at first I did it 7 days a week. Now I do it 5 days a week. But there here's the difference between British and American English. So I've been doing that for 11 years. And I can tell you, I have repeated them probably less than 50 times. So that's 300 new ones every year. You can see there, one of the examples, one of my favorites is coffee cake. So in America, coffee cake is a delicious, wonderful thing, and I miss it very much. But in Britain, coffee cake is cake flavored with coffee. It usually has walnuts. I can't eat it, so it's great disappointment. So trying to count up the differences, they just go on and on and on and on. And even having lived here now for 21 years, I still learn new things all the time. For instance, there's a lot of regional English. If I lived in America, I'd be learning new words all the time. It's not surprising I'm learning new words all the time, but here's an example from a trip I took before the pandemic to Newcastle. And in Newcastle, if you want a breakfast sandwich, it would be a stottie. And once you've eaten it, you want to take a picture of it and share it to promote the cafe. You will Instagram your scran, which is to say your nosh, your snack. Okay, so just lots and lots of stuff to observe. And this is just a sign from around the corner for me, which bollard was a word I'd never used as an American, but it's a word that you use all the time in Britain. And I just always find this sign near the fire department near my house rather puzzling and amusing, but it is about posts that come out of the ground. So why are the two Englishes so different? Well, there are a number of ways of answering that question. One is, of course, Americans and English people live very far apart from each other, and therefore things change in one place, they don't change in the other place. That gives you some of the story, and it's certainly a big part of the story. I mean, even in America, people who live on one side of the Connecticut River talk differently from people who live on the other side of the Connecticut River. Geographical boundary is a big influencer in language change or language preservation. So the distance is something, but if the distance were the whole story, then we'd expect Australians to talk a lot more differently from English people than Americans do. And they don't, their English is more like British English. So distance is part of the story, not the whole story. Another big part of the story, though, is time. So when we think about Canadians or Australians, their English has not been separated from Britain for as long as America's has. So America was, settled by English speakers in the 1600s, whereas there weren't large numbers of English speakers in Canada or Australia really until the 1800s. So there was a lot going on in terms of linguistic change in the early colonies that put down some of the roots of the differences between American and British English. And over time, these things, happen in certain ways in terms of the vocabulary. So take, for example, the difference between punctuation words. Punctuation words, I've got a whole section of it in my book, because they're a great example of a thing that was very much in flux in the 17th and 18th centuries when America was being settled by English speakers. So the words hadn't settled down yet, and there were many words for the dot at the end of a sentence. But English doesn't like having many words for things, believe it or not, even though we've got lots and lots of synonyms. It's said that language abhors synonyms, like nature abhors a vacuum. If you've got two words that mean too much the same, they will start to differentiate themselves, or one will fall out of use. And that's what happened with period and full stop. So, the British people forgot they ever said period. The Americans forgot they ever said full stop. And now we have a difference. Cock and rooster, cock was the British way of saying it. Rooster was probably a dialectal thing in England, but used by puritanical Americans because cock was starting to have another meaning. And so we got a difference. We see a lot of differences in the technologies and the social institutions that changed after America declared independence and sort of before the Second World War, or before large telecommunications. Pretty much anything invented before the Second World War will have different vocabulary associated with it in the two places, because people were getting to terms with these new things completely separately, not talking to each other, coming up with their own stuff. So, here we've got what the British would call a motor car, what Americans might call an automobile. And, one's got a boot and one's got a trunk, one's got an indicator, one's got a turn signal, windscreen, windshield, bonnet, hood, wing, fender, motorway, highway. So a lot of the vocabulary, not just on the car, but in the stuff to do with the car, is different. Tire changed its spelling in Britain. But then the things that existed before these technological updates, the things that came from Old English, from Middle English, from early modern English, those things stay and we share. So we both call that thing a door. We both call that thing a window. We all have grass. Okay. And then the world also evolves in different ways, and the words that we used to share evolve in different ways. So if you think about the way people dressed, the way the royals dressed back when, English people first started coming over to America, the pieces of clothing were entirely different kinds of things than what people like the royals wear now, or any of us wear now. But the words for them have not necessarily been new words. We've taken old words for old things we used to wear and updated those words. And so we've ended up with this vocabulary for things we wear that just has a lot of words in it, like pants and trousers means different things in the two places. So pants, it's very embarrassing when American visitors come over and say, "Oh, I've got a rip in my pants." And everybody goes, "I don't want to know that because it means your underwear." But another example, I'll just give one from this slide here, is that what British people call a jumper and American people call a sweater, that word jumper used to mean a sort of loose-fitting jacket that you put over other clothes to keep warm. And so the British meaning of jumper kept that sense of something you put over your clothes to keep warm, whereas the American sense of jumper in the terms of a kind of dress I had to wear one at Catholic school. That sense of jumper is keeping the original sense of jumper as in it's something loose that you wear over something else. And so we've shared the same word, but as the world has changed, we've put those words to different meaning uses. Okay, so we've been apart in space, we've been apart in time, and then the other reason why America and Britain have differed in their language is the politics and demographics of our different countries. So America is alone amongst the major English-speaking countries. So alone among Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa even, in that it did not have a hard break, or rather, America did have a hard break with Britain. Not as hard as some people might think sometimes, but it was a rather definitive break that we had through the War of Independence, as they call it over here. This meant, for one thing, that Americans started to take pride in speaking a bit differently from the British. Not all Americans and not all the time, but this is a picture of Noah Webster here, and he was very influential in dictionary making, as you'll know, but also in school book making. And he felt strongly that the new country should have its own English. And so they did things like spelling changes and thoughts about pronunciation changes and things like that. So a linguistic patriotism has divided us. But also, because America broke off from Britain, there was a long period of time in which there wasn't that much immigration coming in from Britain. Whereas in some place like Australia, the immigration was sort of constant once it started happening. So the lessened immigration from Britain and more immigration from elsewhere was bound to change American English because people were learning it as a second language, because they were bringing things from their own languages from other places into it and such. And the more people there were in America, the further people started moving west, and the further people started moving west, the further away from England American English got, physically as well as sort of spiritually. Okay. So those are reasons why we're so different. Why are we not more different is another really relevant question to ask. Noah Webster, like many people in his day, thought that within about 200 years, the difference between English in England and Americanish in America would be as different as the difference between Dutch and Danish. He says here, others people said things like they'll be as different as Spanish and Portuguese, because that was their experience of how languages that had been separated developed. But what they weren't counting on was that transportation would get a lot faster, communications would get a lot easier, and there would continue to be a lot of back and forth between America and Britain. So this is a picture that I took when I went to Boston to give this talk to the ESU there of, Boston's always been very close to England in, its English, following trends in England, taking vocabulary from England. So, there's always been some link between American and British English that has not kept them from completely severing their ties. Okay, so that's about the differences in the language, but what about the subtitle of the book, the love-hate relationship between American and British English? And I can tell you, the love tends to go in one direction and the hate tends to go in another direction. So I collect articles like this on the internet and in newspapers where people try to list for their country people words from the other country, and you see these things in American publications. I see them in Reader's Digest now and again and other places. The top 100 most beautiful slang words in English. British slang terms America's should start using immediately. These articles are full of admiration, right? These are words you want because they're British. On the other hand, in Britain, you get articles like this. 41 things the Americans say wrong. I mean, that's an easygoing one. I've seen ones in the 70s of things Americans say wrong. Ugly Americanisms, Americanisms we need to stop, are often the themes of the press in the UK. So thinking about those differences and the views we have of each other, the views each country has of the other, and the kind of view that people often have about Britain in America or about England in America often comes from PBS, right? It comes from masterpiece theater. It's of people with money. It's of people with social power. It's of people who went to Cambridge or Oxford, right? Whereas this is where I live. This is the England I know. This is my neighborhood in Brighton. Quite different from the shows you see on PBS. Other images that Americans get of Britain are things like this. I have never, and I used to have a 4-year-old in Britain. I have never seen a 4-year-old on the streets of England with shorts and knee socks. But this is the view that's sold of England overseas. So you've got these stereotypes sort of brewing of the English as upper class, as wickedly smart, as completely magical, right? So very upscale views of what Britain's like. One of the things that I think is very interesting is how these kinds of programs and films about British life, with the rare exception of something like Trainspotting, do tend to be about upper class life. And when Britain imports things, or rather, I said that wrong, when America imports British cultural products that are about different classes, like, say, the middle classes in The Office, or the working classes like in Sanford and Son and All in the Family, those were all British shows first, but I just forgot the name of the other recent one. But anyway, Americans like to see their British people in these upper class educated sort of ways. And when it's British people struggling or British people being normal people, they just remake the shows with American accents because that doesn't sing to the American market for Britishness, for Englishness. Okay, and so this is all related to something that I call AVIC, or American Verbal Inferiority Complex. And you see this all the time. People make money from American Verbal Inferiority Complex. You can buy mugs about it. Everything sounds better with a British accent. You can buy t-shirts, you can buy bumper stickers, you can find badges or buttons like this, BBC, because terrible news sounds better in a sexy British accent. My favorite one of these is the Las Vegas Tourist Board advertises in the London Underground with this sign: visit a place where your accent is an aphrodisiac. All right, so go to America, British commuters, because that's where you will get lucky, just by having whatever old English accent you have. And just one more example in the AVIC Chronicles. This was a story in Washington, DC a few years ago, where this guy, he was 21 or 22 years old, and he had a British accent. He was from Liverpool or near Liverpool, but he told everybody he was from the fancy parts of London. And because he had an English accent, people believed him, and he got them to buy him, $1,200 glasses of whiskey, and then he'd just leave. And so he swindled people out of all sorts of money in DC just by being charming and having a British accent. And English people will tell you a lot about how they sometimes take advantage of that in America, or at least feel the joy of having people have crushes on them out of their league back home. Okay. Meanwhile, on this side of the pond, this is a greeting card I could buy at a shop in Brighton here. Hey guys, what can I get you? Some service without the ghastly Americanisms. Thank you. Okay, this is people making money out of what I call anti-Americanism. Okay, anti-Americanism is a prejudice against American English. But most prejudices are usually rooted in a bit of fear. And so that I have plenty of new vocabulary words for you here that I've just made up. That fear I call Amerilexicophobia, the fear of American words. And left untreated, Amerilexicophobia can turn into Amerilexicosis, people going downright insane about language. And I can show you some of the symptoms here. So one symptom is irritability. Okay, people get irritable about American words. And so there are lots of articles like this on the BBC and the newspapers. Why are these Americanisms so annoying? Another symptom, once it goes a little bit farther, is paranoia. It's not just that they're Americanisms and we don't like them, it's that they are killing the English language, that language that only over 1 billion people speak. It's threatened by these little words and these spellings without U's. We then get into later stages, hallucinations. Okay, so here's somebody who's written into a magazine called The Week, and he didn't like that they talked about train lines in the magazine instead of railway lines. And they say, if you're going to use this horrid Americanism, then why aren't you calling anoraks wind cheaters? Now, he is trying to say that you shouldn't use American words and therefore don't use the American word for anoraks. But wind cheater isn't anybody's word for anything. Wind cheater with a CH is a British word for what Americans would usually call a windbreaker. But wind cheater, he's just made that one up, right? And they do this a lot, so you can find a lot of made up Americanisms that people really believe Americans say in the British press. So in this case, it says that, Americans pronounce lasso or lasso as lasso. Never heard an American say that, but that's what the Daily Mail says we say. And finally, when you're too far gone with your anti-Americanism and your Amerilexicosis, you end up with delusions of America. So this is from the British newspaper, The Telegraph, and an article that they had a sidebar in this article of 7 Americanisms that people have complained to the BBC for using on the radio. And of these 7 British or Americanisms, only 4 of them are actually American. Okay, so the rest of them, people are they don't like it. And if they don't like it, they assume it's American. So face up instead of confront, that's always been English. Daniel Defoe was the first one to use it, according to the evidence that the Oxford English Dictionary has. It's a big ask is an Australianism. I only learned it once I moved to England. And the last one there was it might have been instead of it might have been, which is, an error that's very common because of sounds like the apostrophe VE that you would use if you were contracting the have there. And what's interesting, well, one thing that's interesting about that is these are complaints about people saying things on the radio. I have no idea how they could tell on the radio that the person had spelt it with OF instead of with apostrophe VE. That's one mystery. But the other mystery is why do they think this came from America when it's used twice as much in Britain as in America? Here's the same kind of data in a different arrangement. So you can see there that the rate of using would have, could have, should have is about twice as high in Britain as in America, and Americans are more apt to spell would have, could have, should have in the prescribed way. Okay, so people get a bit crazy about this, and I'm not surprised, because America the United States is a powerful country, and everybody is afraid of their own culture being harmed by, big, powerful countries and their cultures. I mean, it is a bit ironic for the British to be fearing this when, of course, how did we get America? Through British imperialism. But it is understandable that people do worry about losing their culture. And, if people want to not use American words in Britain, I have no problem with that. It's just when they start to associate American words with bad grammar, with poor hygiene, with whatever else it is that they're associating American words with. And the other thing that just drives me a little bit crazy as a linguist, as somebody who studies language for a living, is that, so much of this panic is based on really bad information. So, a lot of people fear that pretty soon we're all just going to speak the same English and we're going to lose the differences that, make us our own communities, our own, that make me American, that make my husband English, etc. But the thing is, we're mostly not losing our differences. Language is changing because language always changes. But it's not changing to make us all talk the same. And this really surprises people, but it is actually true. I'm going to show you a little bit about that. So one thing is our accents. So when British people hear, kids in London talking in slanging ways, they often complain about them, trying to sound American. They're sounding very different from Americans. All of the accents in England and in America are changing most of the time, but they are just going in different directions. So I'm not even going to dignify that with examples, in large part because I'm very bad at doing accents. But then if we look at spelling, so when spell check came in, everybody over here feared that, we're all going to have to spell like Americans now because Microsoft Word is American, IBM is American, and all these companies, Google's American, they're going to make us spell like Americans. But instead, what seems to have happened is it's heightened people's idea of one spelling is American and one spelling is British. And therefore, the spellings have got more different. So to look in this chart here, this is the suffix IZE or IZE, like in realize or recognize. And in British, it's always been the case that both ISE and IZE are legitimate things to spell. The Oxford dictionaries put the Z spelling first, right? They thought that's the one that we want to go for. And so up until spell check, people happily used S's sometimes, Z sometimes, whatever. But after spell check comes in, what you see is a huge shift, not toward everybody using the American form, the Z form, but towards British people shunning what was a good spelling in English, and going for the spelling that looked least American. So these days, my students will tell you, IZE is not a British spelling. Americans made it up. Americans did not make it up. It was very much a British spelling until basically spell check came in, and then people started railing against the Z as a horrible Americanism. So spelling, the one place where it would be really, really easy for us to become the same, it's just a handful of words. It seems to be getting more different. Vocabulary, there is change in vocabulary because vocabulary is the part of language that changes fastest. I mean, every year, the American Dialect Society chooses a word of the year, and half their list of nominees will be completely new words. We make up new words all the time. We borrow new words all the time. Vocabulary changes throughout the lifespan and every day. But this, I looked at one book about the history of English that was published in 1964 by somebody named Charles Barber. And he wrote about Britons being worried about Americanisms displacing British words, and the ones they worried about most were movie, elevator, canned instead of tinned, and meet up with, which people hate meet up with over here. And in 2019, when I did this slide, Britons were still saying film. They do say movie too, but movie and film now sort of mean different things in British English. They still say lift and not elevator. In fact, the last few times I've been to America, I've seen many signs pointing to the lifts rather than to the elevators. They still talk about tinned tomatoes, and they still complain about meet up with. So that book, 56 years old. Is that right? 57 nearly. And yet the things that people worried about changing still haven't really changed. There's another book that came out within months of my book called American and British English Divided by a Common Language by a linguist named Paul Baker. I do not recommend this book for the lay reader. It's very much a book for people who are into statistical methods for linguistics. But he went through, and instead of saying, I've been hearing elevator more often, I wonder if people are saying that, he asked a computer to take a more distanced view of it and asked the computer to analyze text from the 1930s to 2006, I think his last group was, and to see which words are Americans using, which words are British people using, and are they coming together? And his conclusion was that the two nations are maintaining their differences. And part of the reason why we're maintaining our differences is because even when we become more the same, the language continues to change. So I've got some examples here of what happens in Britain. So here's a pub's menu, and the French fries came over to Britain with McDonald's, but traditionally here, fried potato sticks are called chips, except that now you can get chips and fries. They use fries for thin cut ones and chips for the ones that are the traditional British shape, So even though the word fries has come over, it has not displaced chips. It's just describing something new. Scone or scone came over to America. The one on the left is what British people would call a scone. The ones on the right are things that I found in American recipe sites, and I showed these pictures of scones with icing on them, and I horrify British audiences. That what it is has changed. The words come over, but the recipes then change, and we have words that mean slightly different things. But still, people would think, okay, well, nowadays in our huge pandemic world, in our hugely technologized world, we're all going to talk about the same things the same way now. It's not like back when cars were being invented and the mechanics in Liverpool couldn't talk to the mechanics in Lubbock, Texas. Nowadays, everybody shares the same user manuals and things like that. And yet, we talk about computers much the same, sure, but if you ever try to go to the other country and get a phone that you can carry around with you, you will find not only do we have a different word for the phone, cell phone versus mobile phone, or cell versus mobile, all of the vocabulary around it is really different. When I go to a Verizon store because I'm in America and I want to get a temporary phone, I don't understand anything they're saying because I got my phone in Britain and I know all the British words for the service providers and the kinds of services you get and things like that. So all these things are really different. I just mentioned in passing the pandemic, and let me just throw in, I don't have a slide for this, but let me just throw in a couple more examples. Here we are in this pandemic across the world, having the same kinds of experiences, staying home, perfecting your bread baking, watching a lot of TV, even TV from other countries. And yet when we talk about things to do with the pandemic, we are using different words. So in America, the word quarantine is being used a lot. And in Britain, not so much. In Britain, the word lockdown is being used a lot. And in America, not in the same way. In Australia, they're calling it isolation. You know, so we're doing the same kinds of things. We've got a World Health Organization asking us to do this, and yet we still find different ways to talk about it. Okay, so in the end, what Americans think British people are like, you know, we've got a lot of that upper class, fancy schmancy, proper, having lots of manners, stereotypes. Over in Britain, the stereotypes of Americans can be less positive. So we've got that one there going, I'll have 100 cheeseburgers for free because I rock, and a Diet Coke and a shotgun. No please there. I will pause and say, that's not the only stereotype of Americans in Britain. I also often come across the stereotype that Americans are very good at speaking. And I think that's an interesting one to think about in the English speaking union, that we're very comfortable speaking to others about all sorts of things. But anyway, we've got all these stereotypes, but in the end, we're all just staring at our computers, baking banana bread and hoping that things will get better soon. The only little differences we have are, you know, which language things we're complaining about, and which other life things we have to worry about because of our different political systems. But in the end, we're all just trying to get by, of course. So that's what I have to say to you tonight. I'm really happy to take lots of questions, but in the meantime, I'd like to say thank you very much. And if you'd like more about these subjects, then the blog is called Separated by a Common Language, and it's on Blogspot. On Twitter, my handle is LYNNE Gwist, linguist, and 5 days a week you will get a difference of the day and lots of other things about American and British English. And there is the book, which if I were seeing you in person as originally planned, I would be trying to sell to you and offering to sign your copies. But if you enjoyed this, maybe you'd think about getting a copy for yourself. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Lynne. We already have a number of questions that have piled up, so I'm just gonna jump right into them.
Okay.
So the first is from John Frederick, who asks, what is the great vowel change?
All right, the great vowel shift, this predates British and American English. So we've all been through the great vowel shift. The great vowel shift is what happened. It's the boundary between Middle English and Modern English. So, and it was a systematic change that started in the south of England, where people started taking vowels that they had pronounced a little bit lower in the mouth and started pronouncing them a little bit higher. It happened to all of the long vowels in English. So for example, the word that we now say as beat would have been more like bet. The word that we now say as bite would have been beat, right? And that's why English spelling is so screwed up. You know, why, you know, if you learn any other European language, E stands for not the E sound, but the A sound, because it used to have that sound in English too, but then English had this big vowel change. And so the change started in the South, as I said, moved up through the North, did not get to Scots in Scotland. So if somebody's speaking proper Scots, then the vowels are quite different. You know, they might say spake instead of speak. But that was the great vowel shift, and that's, you know, a good 600 years ago.
Great, so the next one is from Emily Robinson, who asks, it seems like British English has much more slang than American English has. Is this true, and why do you suppose it is?
I don't think it's true. I think we notice things in other people's language that we don't always notice in our own. I think the slang in Britain becomes popular from time to time in America. So Americans are used to thinking about British slang. I think there is a lot of slang everywhere. But a big problem with trying to count it is that nobody has any agreement about what slang the word means. So if you read something like Green's Dictionary of Slang, which I really recommend, it's online now. You can just search it to your heart's content. A lot of the slang there is coming from criminal gangs, from prisons, from all sorts of places, and those groups in both places are coming up with their own words for a lot of things. In terms of slang, like saying that something, calling an umbrella a brawly, or things like that. I mean, I think you just listen to America. People have all sorts of nicknames for things. They have all sorts of ways of shortening things. Watch a few episodes of Friends. They'll do all sorts of funny little things with words, Yeah, I don't think the British have more. I think Americans are charmed by a lot of British slang, but I don't think they have more.
So Stanley Purcell asks, I learned that English and German were in a close race to be our national language. Clearly, English won. Is the German experience involved in American English's development?
Okay, that is basically an urban legend, the thing about German nearly becoming our national language. Dennis Barron, who's a professor at the University of Illinois, I think he has a blog post online about that not actually being the case and how that story spread. I think at one point Hebrew was closer to being considered as a possible national language. So, so I have to sort of put a damper on that. But Germans are a huge part of American immigration, in the 19th century, the early 20th century. And so, of course, did have some effects on English in America, and had some effects on regional Englishes in America. So there are some uses of sorry in Cincinnati that are very much like bitte in German, and some of the things that are peculiar to the upper Midwest, things like saying, do you want to go with? Stuff like that, came over through German or also Scandinavian immigrants. A lot of our traditions around the holidays are very German as compared to some of the traditions, Christmas traditions in England are also very German, but they're sort of not as up-to-date German as American Christmas traditions are. So there's things going on there, but bits and pieces.
So our next question is from Emily Robinson, who asks, do you think it's harder for Brits to understand Americans, or is it vice versa?
Vice versa. So Americans do not have much experience of the full range of British accents. So you hear a lot of people on the television who sound like Harry Potter, who sound like Hugh Grant, but you don't hear that many people who sound like they work in a hairdresser's or at a McDonald's. So there are class accents in Britain are a big deal, and Americans don't have a lot of exposure to the full range. Regional accents are a big deal, and Americans sometimes need subtitles on some programs or films that are from the north of England or Scotland. So yeah, there are a lot of British accents that Americans seem to have a much harder time with. Whereas in Britain, I'm often told by some British people, oh, in America, you don't have accents like we do. They think we all talk the same. They don't hear the differences so much. And I say to them, well, actually, you've watched The Wire, you've watched The Sopranos, you've watched, Nashville. Haven't you noticed that they've all got really different accents? But they're hearing a lot of different American accents often. So it would be basically the American accents that Americans have the most trouble with, you know, maybe from the islands off the East Coast or something like that, that British people would have a hard time with.
Right, so our next question is from Edward Riley, who asks, well, I lived in London Mayfair for about a year for business. In the States, many call folks from the UK Brits. Do Britons resent that? I found they do.
It's kind of like calling an American a Yank. I do have a blog post about that on the blog from years and years and years ago. So if you go to the blog, if you look at it on a phone or an iPad, you don't get the search bar at the top. But if you look at it on a computer, if you use the web version, you can search for that. And there is a discussion there with lots of British people weighing in on whether they find it offensive. And some do, some don't. But I think in general, if it's not, British people are happy to call themselves Brits and enjoy doing that more than they enjoy having other people call them Brits. And you can see why, you know, you want to be able to name yourself or nickname yourself.
So this one's quite short, but it's from Grant Peterson, who just would like an explanation of the word brilliant.
Okay. Brilliant means good. It means amazing. It means awesome. You know, so you know, the way that Americans of my generation would say neat or cool, you know, British people would say brilliant. That's brilliant. You know, so it just means good a lot of the time. I mean, it can also mean the other things that it means, like smart or bright, you know, bright light or things like that. Americans know about brilliant. It's not what a lot of British people would say anymore. And that's another thing about our views of each other's languages, is that British people's idea of how Americans speak is probably, you know, 5 years out of date. Americans' views of how British people speak are probably 20 years out of date because they're mostly watching period pieces, you know. So brilliant, you know, maybe my generation and a little bit older probably say brilliant. Young people say amazing or ace or awesome, you know, which has come over from America.
So Roger Young now asks, how does American English spoken with a Southern accent compare to British English?
I mean, they've got some things that are common to each other. A lot of the features of Southern American English are thought to come from more northern parts of England. So, you know, the Virginia and the Northeast, and then the South were all sort of settled by people from, and Pennsylvania, were all sort of settled by people from different parts of England originally. And the people who came to the South came later and came from more northerly places. Now in the North, that's where language change from London has hit a little bit more slowly. But some of the things that you've got in all sorts of Southern, I mean, there are a lot of Southern Englishes in America, but some of the things there you can see, oh, that came over from this dialect or that dialect. But the pronunciation has been changing for a long time. So, you know, you'll notice some things that are the same, like, I mean, this is less and less true, but, you know, American Southerners who leave the R's off at the ends of words or after vowels, you know, and so say year instead of year. That kind of thing sounds a little bit British to Americans, but it's actually done in quite a different way from how British people do it. You know, the effects it has on the vowel is quite different. So, you know, they've got some things in common, but everything's got some things in common.
So Russell Jones asks, I'd love to know more about why American and English did not diversify in the same way Dutch and Afrikaans did, for instance.
Well, in the case of Dutch and Afrikaans, a big part of the story there was that once the Afrikaners got going, the Dutch wanted nothing to do with them. So there didn't continue to be a back and forth between the Afrikaners and the Dutch for a long time. And also, you know, it is about the different kinds of people who ended up in these places. So the people who ended up in South Africa from Dutch settlers, they were sailors, they were, speaking certain kinds of Dutch, and Dutch, certain Dutch accents or Dutch dialects from that period. So yeah, they just didn't continue to have that back and forth is one reason. Another thing about English is because it has become such a powerful language over the last more than 100 years, first due to British imperialism and then due to American economic power and wars and things like that, they just did have a lot of opportunity to be read universally worldwide, to be, for people to come into contact. So there just was a lot of contact. And I think we can't underestimate that literate aspect. Americans were always reading British books. British people were always reading American books. I don't think that many books were coming down to the Afrikaners.
So Donald Patillo of the Atlanta branch asks to explain the difference with the word peckish.
Peckish means a little hungry. It means you'd like a snack. So I'm feeling a bit peckish. I think I'll go make some cheese on toast. That's the sort of thing you'd say.
Joanne,
in Britain, you put anything you can on toast.
Joanne Bowden Ansley asks, why are E's pronounced as A's, i.e. clerk and as Clark?
I once knew the answer to that question, but now I don't. It goes back to something about how it's old. I mean, and it goes back to something very old, but I cannot remember all the details right now, I'm sorry. But it extends to some other things like Derby and Derby and Berkeley. So the American city of Berkeley, people with that name here would be called Berkeley. But I cannot, it's an old story and I cannot remember right now, sorry.
So Ken Jones asks, do the British frown on their own regional dialects the same way that they might frown on American English?
Very much so. I mean, people are working against that. There are a few projects at universities trying to battle accentism, as it's called. So I've got some stories in the book, like there's a lovely television presenter, she did sports but now has a lunchtime program. And she's got an accent from Middlesbrough, which is in the Northeast. And has a strong Northern accent. And she has got such abuse. And one story she tells is, in her first weeks working for the BBC, she opened an envelope and found a 20-pound note in it with somebody asking her to use that toward her therapy to correct her handicap, her disability, by which they meant her accent. So, it's old-fashioned to hate these accents, but there are a lot of old-fashioned people out there. And it has a lot to do with money and power.
Separate, I enjoy learning that there's actually a pushback at someone who actually enjoys the Geordie accent. So,
I mean, lots of people do, and there's a lot of research on language attitudes around, or accent attitudes around here. And for, it's very common to get somebody from Birmingham being the voiceover artist on a supermarket ad, right? Because that's considered to be sort of warm and homey accent, and somebody with a certain kind of Northern accent might sound more trustable in an insurance ad. So there's all this, psychology of which accents do you want to put with which products, to make people trust you and stuff like that, So it's complicated.
So Roberta Klein asks, that I only recently became aware of the different use of quite between British and American English. What is the difference?
There are many differences, actually. And so there is a big chunk about that in the book. There are a few blog posts about it on my blog. But the main thing that can get people into trouble is that quite means not really in British English, and it tends to be used to mean very in American English when it goes before an adjective. So to give you an example, I once got a survey from a local politician that asked how happy I was with local services. And the choices were very, quite, not at all. All right, so quite was the middle. Whereas for an American, it sounds like, very and quite are practically the same thing. So if somebody says they're quite happy about something and they're English, they're not very happy.
So I think I have a set of questions from Marcy Katzman, essentially looking for the distinctions in US and Canadian pronunciations, brings the words project and progress in their pronunciation in Canada, and Americans taking vacations and Canadians taking holidays.
Well, those are, also British differences. So, saying progress or saying holiday instead of vacation. Canadian English is a lot closer to American English than it is to British English, but people like to focus on the things that are the same. There are other attitudes going on there, but they're just some differences that because Canada separated from Britain a lot later than America did. And also Canada got the British immigrants to North America after the Revolutionary War. So there was still a lot of English going to Canada at a time when it had slowed down going to America.
Brian Decker asks, can you address how the English spoken language is changing based on pandemic shift to digital platforms, including Zoom, FaceTime, email, or texting?
Well, I'm not. Okay. I'm not sure I can comment that much on it because it's not something I've studied. So I'm not really sure if the question is, are we all going to talk the same now that we're all talking online all the time, or are we going to do something different with our pronunciation because we have to do it to a camera? It might be too early to tell. It might not be a big deal. Hard to say. I mean, I'm more aware of the differences that the pandemic's having on our vocabulary.
Clark Goodwin in Atlanta asks, I may have missed it, but would you share a brief version of your autobiography? I know you're an American linguist living in England. When and how did you get there? Before COVID, how many times and for how long would you typically return to the USA?
So I grew up in upstate New York. I went to UMass Amherst for my undergrad and went to University of Illinois for my PhD. And then when I was got my PhD, or when I was about to get my PhD, I was offered a job in South Africa. I went there and taught for 4 years, came back, worked at Baylor in Texas for a little bit, and then looking for a job that I would find a little bit more satisfactory than the job I had at the time, I answered an ad for a job at the University of Sussex, and I have been here ever since. So yeah, that's how I got here. And since I've been here, I've become a British citizen. I've married a Londoner. I've got a child who speaks with an English accent, and all that. I go back quite a bit. I would say I spend all totaled between a month and a half in America every year, except obviously this year. Although I did spend a month in America this year, and 2 weeks of it was in a hotel quarantine.
So Chris Melhuish asked, could you offer some insight on the origin of the Tangier Island accent? It sounds to me like Devonshire or Cornish.
I cannot, off the top of my head, give you a lot on that. There are some interesting programs about it on YouTube that you can watch, but I think the main thing is it does sound like seafaring people from England. Some people say it sounds like Elizabethan English, that sort of thing. So some of the stuff in Tangier Island English, some of the pronunciations do sound a bit more like early modern English, the sort of Shakespearean English. as far as we know, because nobody had tape recorders in Shakespeare's time. So you sort of make your guesses. And one of the guesses is that if you're living as a homogenous people on an island, your language is going to change more slowly than if you're living in a very cosmopolitan place. So it's got a very old-fashioned sound. There aren't that many people there who sound like that anymore, but I do recommend looking it up. I believe the American Tongues documentary, there's a bit about Tangier Island that might be able to be found on YouTube.
All right, so our last question. When I was in England as an ESU exchange student in 1962, so an SSE exchange student, Reuben Johnson, we were reading King Lear for A levels. My master would have me read passages because he claimed my accent was closer to Shakespearean English than today's English accent. Is this true? Do you agree?
There are aspects. I mean, the obvious thing is that in Shakespeare's time, people would have pronounced the R's, right? So they would not have said sir, they would have said sir. They might have had a little bit of a trace of the older vowels, depending on where the character was supposed to be coming from, class-wise or things like that. But I think the main thing, there's one other thing. We think these days of English as having, some people will think these days of British English having sounds like bath and grass and things like that. That is very newfangled. So Shakespearean time, they would have said bath, and in the north and in the Midlands of England, many people still do say bath and grass. So those kinds of things that sound, very upper class British today, and that Americans expect to hear in Shakespeare, they're not Shakespearean at all. There is a pair, a father-son pair. The father is an English linguist named David Crystal. His son is named Ben Crystal, and he's an actor. And they together have done a lot on Shakespearean original pronunciation. And if you look for them on YouTube, I'm sure you will find Ben Crystal reading some Shakespearean proper early modern sounds.
Thank you so much. That was the longest question module that I think we've had in any of our talks. So thank you for sticking around. And
I'm always happy, and I answer a lot of questions online too. So if anybody out there wants to start reading the blog, the comment section, I do ask that people stay on the topic of the actual blog post they're commenting on, but it's a very friendly place where people answer each other's questions as well as me answering them. And I'm very available on Twitter doing my differences of the day every day.
Thank you. So now I'm going to bring Karen Karpovich, our executive director, back in.
Thank you.
Anyway, thank you. Thank you so much, Lynn. It was really worth waiting for. I do hope we can get you to come to the United States, or when you're in the US, bring you out to some of our branches. We will send out the information again on your blog so that people could follow you. Obviously, our group has a lot of questions. I know that they do. And your book is wonderful. And I'm going to give another plug to your book, which I'm sure is readily available. So please read Lynn's book. And if she comes to the United States, maybe she will sign it for you. But thank you so much, Lynn. And I hope to see you all next week on Wednesday for our event on Churchill and the movie mogul. So bye, Lynn. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks so much.